I have one simple question. Does anybody in the Eastern Conference want to make the playoffs? Anyone?
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Locked On NHL Power Rankings. I am your host, Nick Zararis, joined by my co-host, Hunter Hodes. On today's show, we've got a whole lot to talk about, but first, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Hunter, we know 14 of the 16 teams that are going to make the playoffs. The Western Conference is pretty much all locked up, even though Vegas hasn't looked particularly good in quite a while. They're still, by most statistical models, 70 to 80% likelihood to win that second wild card and get in and give some poor, unfortunate soul a really annoying first-round matchup. In the second segment, we're going to talk about the four teams vying for the last spot in the Metro and the second wild card. And then in our final segment of today's show, we're going to vote two more teams off the island of relevancy. I feel like we've known what the format looks like for, I want to say 2 months now. We've had a good feel for who's going to be in the division spots and who's going to be in the wild cards. Let's start in the West because I think we can tie a bow on that a lot quicker than the East. It feels like the West has the bulk of the serious contenders, you know, of the teams that are in the defined playoff spots, the divisional ones. It feels like we have a firm grasp on who's going to be in what spot for most of this season. And really, it's ultimately going to come down to seeding because it's really compressed when you look at the standings out West. It is really compressed.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I mean, we all know who's going to get the number one seed, at least from the Pacific and just the whole Western Conference overall, the Vancouver Canucks. It's funny, Nick, I was on the show with you last week and I said I would be kind of surprised if Vegas stays in that second wildcard spot because I was expecting them to overtake the Los Angeles Kings. Well, since then, the two teams were tied. A week later, the Kings now 4 points up on the Golden Knights for that third spot in the Pacific, though the Knights do have a game in hand on LA. But it's slowly but surely starting to look like we could get another year of Oilers-Kings in the first round, which I really honestly don't want to watch that series again. I know how that's probably going to go with how the Oilers have dominated the Kings in the playoffs over the past couple of years. I want to see Edmonton, Vegas in the first round. I do not need to see Edmonton, LA. But if we do get that, you made the point about Vancouver and Vegas. That would be a first round series. And I know the Canucks have had one hell of a year. Playing the Vegas Golden Knights in the first round of the playoffs would not be fun for them, considering just how Vegas won it all this past year. And they're going to get healthier once the playoffs start. You know, we'll have to see what happens with Mark Stone overall, but I would not want to see Vegas if I were Vancouver in the first round. You have the Central, that we all know who's going to be the top three in the Central. There's no argument there. Winnipeg, Colorado, Dallas. What we have to iron out, though, is who's going to play who in the first round. Nick, are we going to get, for example, Winnipeg, Dallas, or Winnipeg, Colorado, or is Colorado going to win the Central? Who is going to get that 2-3 matchup and just have that, basically that death series? I think that's what I'm going to start calling it. It's the series of death for whoever plays in that 2-3. And then you have the other wildcard team. Nashville looks like is going to get in. And, you know, what a year the Predators have had. You know, they've won 8 of their last 10 games. I did not expect them to be this good this year and to be on the cusp of making the playoffs, but they've surprised me. And I don't think they're going to do too much in the first round, though. I mean, it would be interesting to see how they, you know, stack up to the second best team in the Western Conference. UC Saros can steal a series whenever he wants, but I'm still going to take, you know, Winnipeg, Colorado, Dallas, or Vancouver over Nashville. You know, again, we already discussed Vegas, but outside of that, you know, it feels like the only two teams that are even trying to challenge the Knights for that final spot are the Minnesota Wild and the St. Louis Blues. I don't really trust either of those two teams to get in unless the Knights just totally collapse in their final 14 games of the season.
Yeah, agreed with you in that respect. The West definitely feels like it's going to be the harder path out. I mean, even Nashville, I've brought up that series they played against Colorado a couple years ago where they won one game, but they played really well in that series where they made it competitive. That's the best matchup you can get right now if you're in the Western Conference, which is really saying something because, Nashville, where they are currently in the standings, Nashville has 84 points. That would put them firmly in the first wild card spot with a 4-point lead on Tampa Bay if they were in the Eastern Conference. And they would only be 8 points behind Carolina for second in the Metro. So they are not that in comparison to what that spot is in the East. And we can use this as a segue to transition to the East. And then we'll go a little bit deeper. As far as the top end of the East, I think you and I are in agreement on both Toronto and Carolina, where we got to see it at this point. We have seen Carolina and Toronto have really strong regular seasons for half a decade now, half a decade or more in the case of Toronto. I mean, the first iteration of the Leafs with Matthews, Marner, and Nylander was like 2017, and that team made a playoff appearance. So we've got a half a decade worth of evidence now saying this team is a really strong regular season team, but it doesn't have the right components to be successful in the postseason. I think I am at the point where I am ready to put the Bruins in that category where maybe this is the year it lines up for them like it did in 2019 where they weren't the best team in the East, but they did go to the Cup final. So maybe it's possible for them. But it really does feel like it's Florida, the Rangers, and then everybody else in the East.
I agree. I mean, I've been saying on this show for the last several weeks that the Panthers are the best team in the conference, and you can make an argument.
I think they're the best team in the whole league, in all honesty.
That's where I was going to get to. I think you could easily make an argument that they are the best team in the league. And at this point, I would have Florida coming out of the conference. I understand that right now, if the playoffs were to start
on the Thursday of March Madness, my brother, you're going to say chalk in the East. That's when you know you're in trouble. Like last year, everybody. Yeah, it can't be anybody but the Bruins would be insane. They just had the best regular season of all time. That's what makes this hard to do. That's why hockey is so ridiculous.
I agree. I mean, it's the most random sport out there, and you truly do never know what can happen in a 7-game series. But if I'm picking right now, I do think Florida will come out of the Eastern Conference, but I am also prepared to get old takes exposed if they don't. Yes, they'll be going up against Toronto in the first round if the playoffs were to start today. You would have Boston avoiding playing Toronto, which that makes me sad, Nick. As someone who wants to see chaos in the first round, I need another Boston-Toronto series. I don't need to see Boston going up against Detroit and absolutely kicking that team's butt because I do think Boston would win that series.
Florida's got games in hand. It's not impossible. They're only 3 points back. They've got 2 games in hand. Florida could pass Boston.
I just get nervous because I want to see that Boston-Toronto series. But to your point about the Rangers, I do think at worst they're the second best team in the conference. But what scares me about the Rangers, Nick, is them playing Tampa Bay in round 1. Because Tampa Bay, I know they haven't been the same compared to other years this season, but they have the difference maker in goal. Nikita Kucherov is one of the 5 best players in the world. Steven Stamkos is great. I know defensively they're not as deep as they have been in years past, but they still have the forwards that can strike at will. I think that would be a really close series if we do get Rangers Bolts in the first round. That would be a bit scary for Rangers fans, I feel like.
I mean, you saw it happen last week. The 2 teams played to a push for a good chunk of the game. The Rangers top 9 and the Tampa Bay the bottom 9s of both teams pretty much canceled out. It was pretty much a net like 0.8 in expected goals, something like that. And then the top lines, Tampa's top 3, Point, Stamkos, and Kucherov, they swung the game. They outplayed Zibanejad, Kreider, and Roslovic, and that's what ultimately determined the game. The Rangers took a bad penalty late. Tampa Bay converted on a power play on I think it was Point to Stamkos on a net front play where Point tapped it behind him, and there was nobody within 10 feet of Stamkos. Tampa Bay's got the DNA. I don't think this particular iteration of Tampa is particularly dangerous as far as going the entire distance, but I do think they will make whoever they play in the first round really work for it. I mean, a few weeks ago, we were expecting Tampa Bay to have a dramatic fall off when Sergachev broke his leg at the beginning of February. That really kind of felt like, oh, well, they have one good defenseman, and they've slowly but surely turned it around. Vasilevsky's still not playing great, but there's an opportunity there. But before we dive into the bottom half of the teams pushing for the Eastern Conference's last 2 playoff spots, we are going to take a quick break. It is really annoying trying to buy tickets for events, Hunter. I don't know if you're familiar with this problem or not, but the surprise fees, not knowing where your tickets are, not being able to get customer service if your tickets have issues, all of that stuff makes this process frustrating. But the thing I love about our friends over at Game Time, they make it a lot easier than anyone else. Last minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals. It's easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event in your area. View all views from the seats in the particular venue. Lowest price guaranteed. Big thing for me, all-in pricing. I don't want to get to the last screen and have another $50 of fees and surcharges pop up. Game Time does not have pop-up fees. The best thing, and my favorite thing, the augmented reality view of what the game or event will look like from your seat. If you're going to an older arena where there are bad sight lines, where the scoreboard is in a certain place, you're going to want to see what the view looks like before you buy the ticket. So download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Want to thank everybody who's hanging out with Hunter and I on the first Thursday of March Madness. And I want to remind everybody, you should be watching the Locked On Sports Today feed, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we got your team covered every single day. Here on the Locked On NHL feed, we got the league at wide cover. Here on Thursdays, Hunter and I tackle the big storylines of the week and who are the best teams in the league. So this conversation is not about the best teams in the league, the one we're about to have. We are about to talk about the equivalent of Iowa football. If I had to come up with a comparison, that's what this competition for the second wild card spot in the Eastern Conference.
And that's harsh.
Nobody wants to win. Between the Red Wings, who are 2-8 in their last 10, the Islanders, who are 4-5-1, the Flyers, who are 5-4-1, the Capitals, I want to say, are 5-4-1. Like, nobody wants to pull away. Nobody wants to win 3 games in a row and give themselves some breathing room. It's constantly 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. God help these teams when they start playing each other down the stretch, because the schedule is backloaded with divisional games. The Islanders and Capitals and the Islanders and Flyers, it can be some ugly hockey.
It's gross. Like, I'll give you an example. The Pittsburgh Penguins were playing brutal hockey for the last several weeks. Last weekend, they were 5 points out of the final playoff spot, despite playing gross hockey.
The Sabres, too. The Sabres were only 5 points out, and the Sabres were dead in November.
They were 3 points out last week. That's the crazy thing. Nobody wants to get into the playoffs and play the number 1 seed, whether it's the Bruins, the Rangers. It looks like it's going to be the Bruins, at least for right now. But the Capitals, I mean, they have a minus 31 goal differential. Right now, they're 1 point out of a playoff spot. I'm sorry, that Capitals team is not good. I think they're just trying to get in based on vibes and Charlie Lindgren. I don't really think the Capitals are a serious threat to do anything in the playoffs. The Islanders in their loser points, they have a minus 23 goal differential. Yeah, it was nice they had that 6-game winning streak under Patrick Waugh. They looked like they were starting to turn it around a little bit, but then they've gone ahead, Nick, and lost quite a few games in a row at this point. They're looking like the team that we've seen for most of Patrick Waugh's short tenure so far, outside of that small 6-game winning streak. You brought up Buffalo. Yeah, last weekend, they were 3 points out of the final playoff spot. They've now lost a couple, and now they're back to being 5 points out. The New Jersey Devils, yeah, they just beat the Penguins the other night, but they're still 6 points out right now, and they've lost 7 of their last 10 games overall. They're just not playing well also. And the Red Wings, they have been playing some brutal hockey as of late, losing 8 of their last 10. Dylan Larkin, I know, has been hurt. We had a little bit of a discussion about the Red Wings last week about them being a little too top-heavy overall, and they just haven't been playing nearly as good as they were even a month or 2 ago. Any of these teams that gets that final playoff spot, I feel like is going to get waxed by the top seed in the Eastern Conference. And you brought up the Flyers too. It feels like they're not even trying to get into the playoffs at this point. You have John Tortorella scratching Sean Couturier. And I know Tortorella has done a great job with the Flyers this year, but scratching Sean Couturier for reasons, I don't know about that, man. I think that's
Sending
a
a message.
Galaxy brain thinking right there.
It's a little too high school for me. Like, that's something a high school coach does to send a message to the rest of the group. Like, I understand the psychology of doing a move like that, but these are professional athletes, like, and might not have the same desired effect. So I went and looked while you were talking because I wrote it down, but I wanted to be sure. The Red Wings had their goaltending fall off a cliff. That's the biggest problem with all of these teams. When you are constructed in a fundamentally flawed way, like all four of these teams we're talking about, Flyers, Capitals, Red Wings, Islanders, the Islanders, they're very top heavy. They don't really get depth scoring, and their defense, other than Noah Dobson, isn't particularly good. Detroit has one good defenseman, and poor Mo Seider has the hardest usage rate of any defenseman in the entire NHL in terms of quality of competition and ice time. The Capitals were not trying to be competitive this year, and neither were the Flyers. So when you are those types of teams where you have holes in your roster construction, you are going to be a lot more susceptible to swings of momentum and the PDO bender, ultimately. Detroit's PDO over the last 10 games is 94. They've gotten like 870 something goaltending over their last 10 games. It is impossible to win consistently in the NHL with goaltending that poor. It's the same thing. I mean, the Flyers are in 870, Washington 903 save, and then the Islanders 899 save over the last 10. When you are so dependent on just your goaltending or your special teams, or in the case of Detroit, playing above your metrics, Detroit's metrics are awful, but they were getting the puck in the net, so it didn't really matter for a while. Eventually, that comes back down. That's the story of these four teams. They're all flawed in the way they're designed, so they're a lot more prone to big rises and big dips. I mean, 2 months ago, Detroit rattled off like a 15-2-3. Like, we're not that far removed from that.
Just a few weeks ago, Nick, you and I were on the show. We basically said that Detroit was a lock, it felt like, to get into the playoffs.
Percentage-wise, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, they had a pretty big cushion on all these other teams, but with their recent losing streak, it's allowed all these other teams to get back into it. You brought up their goaltending, and I agree. They can't get a save right now, but they're also, metrically, they're one of the worst defensive teams in the league. Like, their defensive group has just not been good throughout the season. And I think it's something that Steve Yzerman is going to have to really improve once the summer gets underway, near the draft late June and then into free agency in July. You brought up the Islanders with their goaltending problems as well. Ilya Sorokin has not had a good year this year. No. And that continues to surprise me because when he's on his game, there are not three goalies in the league who are better than him, but he hasn't been able to give the Islanders as many saves this year as he was last year. I think that's going to improve next year. I mean, it has to, considering the contract that he has and with how good he is, but he has not played well enough for the Islanders overall. And, we already discussed the other teams with Washington and their negative goal differential. Charlie Lindgren has been a really good story, I think, for the Capitals. And more games than not, he has kept the Capitals in it. But how is that going to fare over a 7-game series if this Caps team gets in? And then they also are missing quite a few high-end talent players right now. I mean, yeah, it's great that Ovechkin's starting to wake up a little bit again. I mean, I still hope that he does chase down Gretzky's goal record. Dylan Strome has been a great find for Washington overall, but Oshie's hurt again. They obviously don't have Backstrom. Kuznetsov's not on the team anymore. Yeah, John Carlson is still a pretty solid defenseman, but I just don't see enough there, even with all of those kids in their lineup, that makes me go like, yep, that team is going to go in there and give one of the top teams in the East a scare. Yeah, it would be good for their young kids to experience playoff hockey, but I just don't think the Capitals are going to do, too much to one of the top teams in the conference. This is going to be hilarious to see over the final month of the season, to see who keeps playing the musical chairs.
Okay, Hunter.
You want it. You want it.
Of those four teams, pick two that get in. Of Philadelphia, Washington, Detroit, and the Islanders, pick two. We've got about 30 seconds. Pick two. No explanation.
Give me Philadelphia and Detroit. I think those will be the two teams that get in. I don't trust any of the other teams, but hey, we'll see if I get old takes exposed on that. But I'm not confident in Detroit, but I'm more confident in Philadelphia, so I'm still going to go with those two. What about you?
I'm going to say Philadelphia, and I'm going to say the Islanders, because I think the Islanders are going to be able to hang around with a lot of these teams. And frankly, I just like their high-end players better than the other guys. Like, Barzal, Horvat, Dobson, Brock Nelson. That's better than Detroit's 3 guys. That's better than Washington's 3 guys. That's better than Philly's 3 guys. When in doubt, go with the team with the best stars. And in a minute, we are going to talk about teams that are not really in the conversation anymore. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And we also are going to talk about our friends at Ibotta. Grocery bills are so expensive these days, but now they don't have to be. Start getting cash back on your grocery shopping with the free Ibotta app and get cash back every time you shop. You love making money, but also spending money? Don't we all? Now you can make money while you spend it every time you shop with Ibotta. Ibotta is a free app that gives you the most cash back every time you shop on hundreds of items, from groceries to beauty supplies to toys, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. The average Ibotta user earns $256 a year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, so you can buy that flight you've been eyeing, that game you've been dying to go to, or the fancy dinner you've been craving. Other apps give you points that don't amount to much. With Ibotta, just add up your offers in the app, upload your receipt, and get real cash that you can cash out to your bank account, PayPal, or gift cards. Join the over 50 million users and earn cash back every time you shop from over 2,700 brands and retailers, including Lowe's, Macy's, Sephora, Best Buy, and more. Right now, Ibotta is offering listeners $5 for just trying Ibotta using the code LOCKEDONNHL when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app to start earning cash back and use code LOCKEDONNHL. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store, and use code LOCKEDONNHL. Now, Hunter, when we talk about the bottom of the barrel here, we've talked quite a bit about these teams that are in the lottery, these teams that aren't particularly relevant, and we've talked a lot about the teams that underperformed expectations. I know we talked about the Sabres in the last segment, but we came into this year expecting the Sabres to be in the mix for one of those playoff spots in the East. We expected to see some signs of life from the Columbus Blue Jackets, which didn't really amount to anything. It's really befuddling when you look at some of these teams. We can talk about the Penguins. We can talk about the Devils. We can talk about the Coyotes. We can talk about the Kraken. We could talk about the Flames. There are a lot of teams that just dramatically underperformed expectations. And instead of people like filling in that void, it's just kind of been one big mid-off at the middle of this, at the literal middle, that nobody wants to pull away from anybody.
Right. I mean, we just had that discussion about the Eastern Conference playoff race, and to a similar extent, it's pretty similar in the Western Conference as well. If we're voting a team or two off the island for this week, I'm starting with the Seattle Kraken. They've lost 3 in a row, 6 of their last 10. They have 68 points right now, 11 points back of the final playoff spot with 15 games to go. It's over for the Kraken. And I really liked the season that they had last year. They're able to get that big upset series win in the first round and, get to the second round of the playoffs in just their second year overall as a franchise. But this year they kind of came back down to earth a little bit. They still don't have enough high-end star talent for my liking, and I figured their goaltending was also not going to be that good again this year. I still feel like they need to address that over the offseason as well. With the Kraken, I've said this before a couple of times. I don't think they were as bad as they should have been in their first year, but I also don't think they were as good as their record said they were in their second year. I think the Kraken are more of what we're seeing this year, kind of a mediocre team that's not fully ready to be a perennial playoff team every single year. So I'm voting Seattle off the island as one of the teams this year, Nick.
Yeah, Seattle is a textbook example of what happens when you have to ride the goalie carousel. Like we were just talking about with the 4 teams for those 2 playoff spots in the East. Seattle's in the same exact boat. They don't have the high-end talent. They don't have a ton of high-end talent to kind of make up gaps in their lineup. So the clear holes in their roster, they ultimately are dependent on that ebb and flow. And in Seattle's case, being that their goaltending is very volatile, they are prone to extreme lows like year 1 where they were god-awful. And then last year where they had league average goaltending, but they had really strong 5-on-5 play. And in the regular season, that's a really solid format. But again, you're running it back with the same volatile goalies. And what makes goaltending so difficult is it's really hard to be consistent year to year if you're not one of the really good goalies in today's league. So as a team, when you are constructed around 2 volatile goalies, sometimes you're just going to have to eat the L on an entire year. It's really unfortunate, but you look around the league, we talked about Ottawa last week, same exact boat, where they have tried so many different goalies there, and it just hasn't worked. When you are so dependent on a goalie coming in year after year, and this will be the guy, this will finally fix the problem, it's still a problem. The reason goalies become available isn't because, they're great and they're trying to get as much money as they can. It's because the team that had them wasn't convinced this guy was a long-term starter. And that's generally what you're going to get in free agency. Agreed.
And I kind of get that sentiment to the other team that I would vote to kick off the island this week, and that is the Montreal Canadiens. I don't think we've kicked them off the island yet, Nick. I know we did Ottawa last week. They traded Jake Allen to New Jersey, who really wasn't playing that well this season. He's looked a little bit better in New Jersey, but they have Caden Primo, and they also have Sam Montembeault. He's started 33 games, .905 save percentage. Him and Primo have at least been close to league average this year, but it's still not good enough for a Canadiens team that I know wants to take that next step eventually in their rebuild and start making a push to get back to the playoffs. I do think this is a Canadiens team that has quite a bit of talent. I love Mike Matheson on their back end. I've always been a big fan of Nick Suzuki, Cole Caulfield, all those guys, but they also need to figure out their goaltending situation heading into next year as well, because while I don't mind Montembeault, I don't think he's a full-fledged starter on a perennial playoff team. I think they're going to have to improve in that area for next year if they want to take that next step overall. And the Canadiens, we figured this will be a year where they continue to rebuild and not make the playoffs, but I think they're going to try to take that next step for the 2024-2025 season. So I'm voting to kick them off the island this week as well.
Montreal also needs to start getting some of these prospect defensemen over here. Like, Lane Hudson is in year 2 at BU. No, at BC. No, at BU. I was right the first time. Yeah, Lane Hudson's at BU. They drafted Reinbacher last year. He's had a really rough season over in Europe. He needs to get over here and get into their developmental system. Montreal is... And I can say this as somebody who had Jeff Gorton oversee a rebuild of one of the teams I take an interest in. He plays it very slow. They draft, and I wrote about this. I wrote something really long about this. They drafted 35 players in a 4-year period. The Rangers did from 2018 to 2021 when Gorton was the general manager, and then Drury was the one for the 2021 draft. But over a 4-year period, they drafted 35 players. Of those 35 players, 7 are currently on the Rangers active roster, and then 11 total are NHL regulars. That's not a huge hit rate. Montreal is in year 2 of this process. They're going to need to continue turning over their roster and get cheaper and get younger. Gallagher is still getting paid a decent chunk of money. Josh Anderson is still getting paid a decent chunk of money. So as they continue to turn it over, they are getting there. They are getting younger people in their system. It just might not be fast enough. That's really my takeaway with Montreal. They need a lot more volume. They need more throws at the dartboard because not every guy you draft is going to hit ultimately. But that'll just about do it for today's show. Any last word you want to get in, Hunter, before we wrap up?
No, this is one of the best times of the year to be a sports fan. You got March Madness starting today. The NHL playoffs start in a month. This playoff race is going to be a lot of fun down the stretch. So let's see what the standings look like, Nick, when we have the power rankings for next week and see if anything changes.
That'll do it for Hunter and I. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. Leave the show a 5-star review if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you are over on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like the video. Hunter and I will see you next week.